But the rocket has to be many things. It must answer to a number of different shapes in the dreams of those who touch it. In combat, in tunnel, on paper. It must survive heresies shining, unconfoundable. And heretics there will be. Gnostics who have been taken in a rush of wind and fire to chambers of the rocket throne. Kabbalists who study the rocket as Torah, letter by letter. Rivets, burner cup, and brass rose, its text is theirs to permute and combine into new revelations, always unfolding. Manichaeans who see two rockets, good and evil, who speak together in the sacred idealalia of the primal twins. Some say their names are Enzian and Blachero, of a good rocket to take us to the stars, an evil rocket for the world's suicide, the two perpetually in struggle. This is Books of Some Substance. I am your host, David Southard, and once again, I am joined by Seth from Waste Mailing List to talk about Gravity's Rainbow. Enjoy. All right, Seth, we're back again to talk Pynchon and Gravity's Rainbow, and this time we're going, I think, a more general approach. I think we'll start first with sort of the big picture, and then we'll go down to those parts that make up the big picture. So I'm just going to come right and ask, other than the reading that we approached in the last episode, what is this book about?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because that is, despite being a very simple question on its face, probably among the more difficult ones to answer when discussing Pynchon in general, but Gravity's Rainbow principally among them. Just a brief diversion from your question. I think back to Chris Via when he covered the novel on his channel, and he has this very funny segment where he's trying to sum up the book, and he's like, he very astutely captured it. He said, when most people try to describe Gravity's Rainbow, it goes something like, well, it's about a rocket, it was a real rocket, and it's in World War II, and Pynchon's trying to, there's science, and it just kind of devolves from there, because it really is a multi-limbed beast. But let's take a shot at it, and I actually might start with just a bit of a quote from Steve Weisenberger. It's not from his Gravity's Rainbow companion, as far as I remember. I don't tend to go back to that one too often. We may get into that in a bit. But he says, there's a line. Oh, I actually think it's from the Pynchon Cambridge companion. Anyway, he says, Gravity's Rainbow is a novel that uses history to represent core contradictions and dilemmas of the twin projects named America and modernity. And you could say that's kind of part of Pynchon's larger authorial project in general. So if I kind of use that as a starting point, I mean, GR, diegetically speaking, depicts the German efforts to design and operate a prototype ICBM, and then slowly reveals how this project was the result of an intergovernmental technocratic industrial cartel whose salient concern was not sides in a theater of war, but rather a celebration and proliferation of capitalist markets. And Pynchon humanizes this realization through the perspectives of a number of different characters on various fronts of that war who experience a derangement of their bodies, their minds, their souls. You could apply that to any number of characters. And all of this occurs under a system that oppresses you and asks you to thank it in return. That's my pitch for you. What do you got for me?
I think that's incredibly accurate, and I think he does this through ostensibly a main character of Slothrop, who you see, which we'll get into, his disintegration, as I think it is referred to, and through that concept of elite and preterite. And that last idea of you end up thanking them for it was really interesting. I can't remember where it is. I think it might be near the end when, is it Pointsman is having a conversation? and he's talking about the they and the we mentality. Do you, oh, I wish I could remember this. I hadn't had this prepared, but you triggered it in my head. But when he's talking about how these two things occur, and then also with the dissolution of the counterforce near the end of the book, where they're interviewed, I think in the Wall Street Journal
it's the
or
Wall
something.
Street Journal.
I can't remember. Yeah. Okay, which is just a perfect representation of all of this, and they become sort of part of the system, and I think you see that through what may start as something interesting and open and possibly freeing in the zone, which of course is co-opted. You see it in Slothrop, who is, like I said, ostensibly this main character who pretty much serves as this commodity entity for the combinations of business interest, IG Farben, his father selling him to that company as a child, military interests, and all of these things. So I think through that individual lens on the sort of main character, and then as he falls apart and you see all of these other separate characters becoming enmeshed in that system. Yeah, I think that quote from Weisenberg is great. And the choice to situate this historically in World War II, where that confluence of American superiority and modernity in its mechanized forms and what will come is just, it's the perfect point in history in which to set a novel with these themes and with these ideas.
And just kind of riffing on that point that you say, this is the perfect point in history. I noticed you had a little bit of a note in our sort of collective document of notes that we've put together for this episode about the brennschluss point along the timeline. Maybe if you want to tessellate that out a little bit further, and we can kind of discuss where that takes a reader from an interpretive standpoint.
The brennschluss point, talking about the point in which I don't know how to refer to it in physics terms, but when you refer to it in the missile, when the missile sort of makes that arc and begins its dissension, I guess you would call it. Is that the best way to refer to it?
If I just briefly touch on that, my interpretation or my understanding of the brennschluss point is, if you think about the V2, literally how that rocket worked is it had liquid oxygen fuel that propelled it upward in the ascending arc of its pathway. And there's a point along that upward arc where essentially it runs out of fuel, the engines switch off, and then it is at that point, and I believe the exact words that Pynchon uses in the novel is, it's gone pure ballistic. The rocket is on its own, right? It is entirely subject to what gravity and the forces of momentum and inertia have already established upon it prior to those engines switching off.
Yeah, so the idea that America, after this war, sort of solidifies its position of power, and there's an interesting sort of play on language. If Pynchon is saying that this is that point culturally or civilizationally, that it has already tipped over to that point and we are in sort of full descent. Maybe this is the decline. Early on in the book, I think it might even be like the first 4 or 5 lines. And granted, this is a sort of fever dream, just a simple line, "It is too late," kind of rings in my head as it's already over. There's not enough time to really do anything. But then there is this, maybe if you want to read it as a glimmer of hope in the end, where, as we talked about in the other episode, the now freezes and slows down, where the missile is hovering above the theater. And there is time if you need the comfort to touch the person next to you or to reach between your own legs. Just that little glimpse of time as possibly we are teetering on something that we can possibly change. Although whether or not we can change anything in the culture in this balance of elite, preterite, of powerful and powerless, I would say, is the entirety of the novel pretty much undermines the idea that there's some hope other than in maybe Pynchon's creativity. There's something there, perhaps. I don't know if I'm. I feel like I'm rambling.
Not
I
at all, not
apologize.
at all. And this is a book that most definitely compels a reader or a thinker about it to ramble. But I just want to kind of respond to a couple of notes you had there. And the first of which is your use of the word teetering, how we're just on the edge of something here. If you take it back to that brennschluss point, think about it literally. You've got a period of time where the missiles shut off, where the engines shut off within the actual missile itself. And when it actually starts to arc back down in its descent toward its eventual impact and explosion. We talked a lot last episode about this, or in the other episode where we discussed the concepts of the superimposition of the American 1960s over the European 40s. And I think this concept of brennschluss maps nicely onto that insofar as the V2 was the progenitor of the modern intercontinental ballistic missile, but it took a number of years before it reached its full potential. That, the Nazis are creating this thing in the 1940s, and it's really not that complicated of a weapon by modern terms. But its potential, the vehicle into which a nuclear bomb could be loaded, only decades later. And that is the thing that proliferated across the globe, and all the major superpowers left on the planet now have arsenals of these things that at any moment we could fire out at one another and, call our collective ruin on the planet. And I see that moment right at the end, and somehow only 12 minutes into this episode, we're already getting right to the end of the book. But that moment with the rocket hanging right over the Orpheus Theater in LA, some people would like to say that that's the V2 that was either fired at the beginning of the book or the V2 that entombed Gottfried near the end. I'm not convinced it's the same rocket. I think it is a nuclear bomb. I think the 1960s were the period of time where we have passed brennschluss, and we are now essentially living with the momentum and the choices that we made in the decades prior. And we are subject to a world that has gone pure ballistic. We are no longer at a place where we can turn back from this. Everyone's got nukes. Everyone could destroy everyone at a moment's notice. And we are sitting at that point, teetering on the edge of a rocket over top of our theater. And what's going to happen? And you said, he doesn't leave you a lot of room for hope. But I think if Pynchon was truly pessimistic and he didn't see any possibility of hope, I think the rocket would have touched the Orpheus Theater. I don't think he would have left you with that delta T, that little glimmer. It's not much. The world is fucked. I think we all agree on that right now. But there's that little bit that maybe, just maybe, we could turn it around. And I think that's part of what doesn't make it a deeply, deeply depressing book to read. I mean, it does at times, and it'll take something out of you for sure. But I do think there's a small degree of hope in there.
I would say in my more optimist mode, I might agree with that. And I think you can certainly read it that way, but I think the way he says there's just enough time just for a little bit of comfort. Maybe you can just reach between your legs. Maybe you can do this other thing. It's almost as if he wants to say, get your jollies in while you can because it's all over. But that's, I think, the pessimist reading of the ending, which is also a funnier reading if you have a dark sense of humor, which I think Pynchon does. And I think anyone who finishes the book probably shares, because you need a dark sense of humor, I think, to get through a large parts of this book. Yeah. So I think, though, also the hard part about it, and we mentioned this before, is, and there's another quote early on in the novel, I think also maybe in the first couple of pages, It's a very popular quote. This is not a disentanglement from, but a progressive knotting into. And I think that also makes it hard to get at what the novel might be about, or if you want to try to understand it in a simple plot way, which you mentioned another booktuber humorously sort of talking about how it's impossible to describe this book, because it is. You are just given, like Slothrop, all of these nodes in which you're trying to connect very complex ideas and systems, and it can be a mess to read at times, and if you're trying to really understand it. And I think maybe we can get into it into specifics, right? So why don't we go with the motivate? I think you refer to it as the inciting mystery.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I think it might not be a bad place to start, because I think that's where a lot of like the plot spreads out for
what is going on with Slothrop's cock? Yes. Love it. Let's do it.
Yes. Everybody wants to know.
I think you and I probably converge fairly well on our understanding of this. Just in a sentence, what do you think's going on with Slothrop's cock?
I think it functions the way a cock normally does and has almost no real connection to where bombs are falling.
Couldn't agree more. Now, Pynchon, being the eternal riffer and troll that he is, he loves to lay out all these little breadcrumbs and take you in a number of different directions. And I really like to picture 80-something-year-old Tommy Boy sitting in his New York apartment right now, reading all these troves of academic literature that focus on the mystery of Slothrop's erections and what they're responding to, and spinning all these pseudo-intellectual yarns, when in actuality, is it really about anything? You know, there's here's one you could go with. Slothrop's erections are responding to fascistic violence and subjugation imposed on the preterite, or the have-nots, as kind of Pynchon views them. There's a line from, I think it's page 200 something. It was in the Casino Hermann Göring section, and the line reads, "Once something was done to him in a room while he lay helpless. His erection hums from a certain distance, like an instrument installed, wired by them into his body as a colonial outpost here in our raw and clamorous world, another office representing their white metropolis far away." I mean, wow, what a sentence. Like, he has put a lot of thought into this concept of the erection as this sort of, you use the term nodes to wire into, this sort of entry point into this colonial hydra that is subjugating all different stratifications in people across the globe in different ways as they relate back to the functioning of this military industrial complex cartel, der Raketen-Stadt. We'll get back to that. But then you go a couple hundred pages ahead into that kind of last chapter in that Wall Street Journal article by the Counterforce spokesperson, and Pynchon completely negates this by saying there never was a Dr. Yamf, opines world-renowned analyst Mickey Wookstree. Yamf was only a fiction to help him explain what he felt so terribly, so immediately in his genitals, for those rockets each time exploding in the sky, to help him deny what he could not possibly admit, that he might be in love, in sexual love, with his and his race's death. It's just this mystery that Slothrop's been trying to solve the entirety of this book. It kind of came down to, there actually never was a guy who programmed your dick, dude. I'm terribly sorry to admit it to you. And then he just further doubles back and says, well, can we actually trust this map that is found in the very beginning in Tantivity's office? It's not the gentlemanly reflex that made him edit, switch names, insert fantasies into the yarns he spun for Tantiby back in the Akchung office, so much as the primitive fear of having his soul captured by a likeness or image or by name. You know, he theoretically made it all up. I think it really comes down to it actually doesn't mean a lot. It's someone who's looking for meaning in this entropic, cruel mess that is the war machine. Do you agree?
I agree 100%. And I think when you finally see him give up on this quest to really find what it is he's searching for, well, we can get into what happens to him, but when he kind of gives up, he is no longer the main drive of the narrative. And there are so many scenes throughout the novel that I think undermine the idea that he is somehow this precognitive erectile missile magnet. It just, yeah, I think that's it exactly. There's too many things that undermine it. There's no indication or that one map was created prior to another. I think the narrator or another character points this out at some point, and I wish I knew where or had a quote to back that up. But yeah, there's just too much there that undermines it, and the fact that it falls into the background, I think, is proof of it being just another possible rabbit hole instead of being this great mystery that has some sort of key answer.
Yeah, it's just this. Yeah. Go on.
It is one of many, and maybe we can talk about the others, one of many sort of supernatural fixations of the novel that I don't really know what to make of, actually. We never really talked about it, but there is this magical, fantastical element in the novel that just appears here and there throughout. And maybe it's always filtered through a character, but it's certainly a part of it, whether it's a seance, whether it's sort of godlike figures watching from a distance, tarot readings. I mean, we talked about Byron the Bulb. There's so many variations on...
You've got people descending down toilets as well.
Yeah. So why don't we go then to, I think, just since we're on the note of Slothrop, instead of going down the rabbit hole of fantastical things, what do you make of his sort of fate by the end of the novel? The way he dissolves into the narrative goes in many different directions.
That sort of moment, his fragmentation into a crossroads, which happens in, I believe, the very first chapter of the In the Zone segment, which is uncoincidentally kind of the part of the book where the whole thing breaks down wholesale and any sort of semblance of narrative cohesion dissolves. I mean, look, the interpretations of this are about as, manifold and multitudinous as there are interpretations about what's going on with that inciting mystery we spoke about. And scholarly and critical analysis have... So much of it are people trying to take the pieces of Slothrop and kind of haphazardly piece them back together. I've seen people who sort of try to search for some sort of nobility in Slothrop's transcendence, if you want to call it that. I don't really think it is. Some sort of some spiritual elevation or a creative paranoia, if you will. Maybe it's a representation of allegiance to the counterforce or the counterculture, anti-capitalist anarchy, or some sort of return to tribal animism or spiritual transcendence. There's so much of that, so many of these kind of highfalutin conceptual readings of it. I really just view it as a person, an individual microcosmic identity, disassociating and dissolving from the horrors of the technocratic cartel that we live under, an escape, or maybe a freedom, but that's arguably too optimistic, from the shackles and binds of the system that we live in. What do you think about it?
Once again, we're in agreement. I think there's ways in which you could interpret his disintegration as a Buddhist kind of enlightenment of abandoning self and becoming a part of the landscape, a part of the narrative. I think it's him coming to the realization, and he does it mostly, I think, maybe at the beginning of part 4, but also from part 3 as well, where he realizes that all of these things have been sort of haunting him and chasing him and pursuing him, and he's been searching for answers, and the answers won't come, and they largely won't come because he can't reach them, and he comes to a sort of realization that his self has been made up of so many other things outside of him. And I think he's this character that, and I mentioned before that I think this novel is such a great postmodern novel in the sense of that aspect of the self being composed of all these other parts that you don't have much control over. And I think that is really what it is. I think it's a breakdown in the truest sense of him no longer knowing what it means for a self to be a self. And so, yeah, he no longer can even exist in a physical state. And that goes into something that is somewhat fantastical, the idea that I think there's a character that talks about how he can't even really see him at all. He's barely perceptible. I'm in agreement with you there.
This idea that he gets absorbed into the landscape and becomes no longer perceptible, sort of this specter or wraith that kind of haunts both the zone, occupied Germany in the 40s, and also these flashes forward into the 1960s. And I think there's a reading, and this is getting into one of those sort of quasi-academic readings, but there is one that I think, whether or not it has weight remains to be seen, but I find it interesting, and that's Slothrop as an Orphic figure, or an Orpheus figure, which I do think has its merits, given that Pynchon name drops Orpheus several times in the book. You know, that segment we talked about before, which was the Richard M. Schlub, owner of the Orpheus Theater segment. That chapter is called Orpheus Puts Down Harp. I'll give you a Greek history class in about 15 seconds here. Orpheus is basically a poet who tamed the world around him through music and song. He's kind of most famous for the story of him descending into hell, into the underworld to save his wife Eurydice. But then he accidentally banishes her for all eternity by glancing back at her during their ascent out of Hades. Now, that's kind of where a lot of people leave the Orpheus myth, but what a lot of people forget is that his life ends later on when he's dismembered by a band of Greek Maenads, and his head and harp are thrown into a river where they float singing out to sea. I think that relates kind of nicely to Slothrop's journey, initially going down the toilet, searching for his harmonica, which is referred to as his mouth harp, and then that scattering of the harp and subsequently Slothrop across the zone in the future of America in part 4 of the novel. There's that line back in the beginning when he's down in the toilet, and it's the narrator reads it. It is a place sheltering from disaster, not necessarily the flushings of the toilet. These occur here only as sort of inferred disturbances behind this ancient sky in its corroded evenness of tone. But something else has been terribly at this country, something poor soggy Slothrop cannot see or hear. You talk about this idea, his realization that there's something bigger than him going on, but you know, how much agency does he actually have? You referred to him as a narrative driver. I don't think he drives the narrative at all. I think this story happens to him, and what he has to come to is the realization that his part in this dog and pony show is really actually quite unremarkable. He is locked in, wired into a system that's going to function with or without him. And you can't give someone like that a noble death, a moment of disappearance. They just have to essentially be subsumed into it. and have their music just sort of scattered out there into the world. And you see that particularly as it pertains to music in part 4 when Slothrop shows up as a member of one of the bands that's playing on the radio. I can't remember what their name. I think they're like a Beatles analog, but I don't know if these are loosely drawn yarns or actually something coherent. But I do view him as something of an Orphic figure. I don't know if you want to offer your take on that.
I think it's another possibility of interpretation, but ultimately, like you said, I think Slothrop is not a narrative driver. He's an example of a person being used in a system that will use whatever it can to propagate itself and has no real interest in any particular individual, right? And so reading him in any multitude of ways is interesting and fun, certainly. He ultimately is just this, to overuse the cliche, a cog in the machine, which is them, whatever them happen to be, this combination of governments, corporate interests, military interest.
I could take it in a dirty direction. You could say he's not a cog in the machine, he's a cock in the machine. Sorry, is that too lowbrow for books of some substance? There you go. Have that for free.
We are the
excellent. Excellent
choice. Speaking of they and them, do you view them as the ultimate they, them, whatever they happen to be, as a sort of ultimate antagonist of the novel, or is there something more?
I mean, he doesn't. By he, I mean Pynchon. He doesn't make it easy with determining one simple they. You know, I think one of the places that people go is the rocket, and look, that's a nexus of narrative focus for a lot of the different characters and the different sort of interests of the novel. But I think it's emblematic of the eschewal of humanity in favor of the technological empire of tomorrow. But it's not. I think that's too simple. It's too clean. The rocket is not the problem. The rocket is a symptom of a larger problem. Pynchon isn't scared of the V2 as far as I'm concerned. He's more fixated on the conditions that led to its proliferation, 1940s, and more importantly, what grew out of it in the decades that followed, 1960s. You know, the Bomark missile, the nuclear bomb loaded into that ICBM, drones, surveillance equipment. It's bigger than the rocket. The rocket is just this distillation or aggregation of all these things, this little kind of prototypical point. And I don't think it's an accident. Well, I guess it is an accident, but it's a convenient accident that one of the two German names for this rocket is the aggregate 4, aggregate 4. And, you know, you can't help but pick up on that pun that it's this aggregation point, which again is kind of ironic because the function of a rocket is not to aggregate but to explode outward, which is exactly what it did. Not literally the explosion of a rocket, but literally as in the technology of the rocket. That's one possibility. Before I move on to other ones, why don't you give me one of your thoughts on what the overarching antagonist or they of the novel is?
I feel like I kind of laid it out, and I think you did a great job of distilling it into the proliferation of death machinery, which I think is just one instance of how, at least in terms of the novel, the elite will use whatever tools they have available, and whatever humanity seems to cook up, they will use to their advantage, whatever that might be. Whether it is in weapons of war, in pharmaceuticals, in light bulbs, as we talked about previously, whatever it is that can keep them churning those wheels of power, they will use to their advantage. Even in the face of conflict, they will use the ideas of nationalism, to their benefit. They will use whatever it happens to be. And I think Pynchon does that by keeping them loosely undefined and distant throughout the book. But it does, I think, many of the motivations of, or the negative motivations of humanity, I think, are also sort of under attack by Pynchon and I think you might have mentioned in Rocket City. You know the German off the top of your head,
Der
I'm sure.
Raketen-Stadt. It's
there it
that
is.
term he uses repeatedly throughout. It literally translates to the Rocket City or the Rocket State.
In our notes, we sort of talk about it being this perfect example of, or at least in my mind, of so many of the things that Pynchon seems to be criticizing. The fascistic impulse, military-industrial complex, exploitation of people's sexual exploitation in Blasero's sort of disturbing sadomasochistic rituals. It just comes to a head in that space, which I think is him criticizing, I think, people and maybe human nature in general. But even outside of that, I think there is this nebulous they, them of the paranoid's mind, which we can also get into, that will use even those aspects to their advantage. And there's a part of me that, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I agree wholeheartedly. But if you're going to evoke the term paranoid, which is done repeatedly in this book in the Proverbs for paranoids, you need to once again examine what that word actually means. And I think we talked about this in our Lot 49 episode. But paranoia is essentially a fear or a preoccupation with threats to oneself that aren't actually a reflection of reality. They aren't real. And I guess the question that I pose to anyone reading this book is it true paranoia if the things that Pynchon is describing here did actually come real and were actually true? You know, we talk about this abstracted idea of der Raketen-Stadt, this kind of, I've always called it the oozing infected center of the book. But I think you could give it, you could take it as a concept and actually give it a sort of corporeal body to it. And I would lay the blame of this at the feet of one Interessengemeinschaft Farbenindustrie, or IG Farben, as it's repeatedly evoked in this book. And just like you said, this idea that these companies are happy to produce anything that will prop up their bottom line. Perfect example of IG Farben. Massive figure in the entertainment industry because they produce color film stock. Amazing. We love films. They also produced Zyklon B, which was used in the gas chambers in the Holocaust. Two companies doing the exact same thing. And then, one company doing two entirely different things, I should say. And in the kind of declining years of World War II, IG Farben actually came under Allied control. And the initial intent was to have this thing dismantled. But as the end of World War II kind of slid into the Cold War, the idea of liquidation became less and less attractive. And thus the IG and all its manufacturing capacities were divided and split up and disseminated among the Allies. And it kind of aggregated into three companies you would recognize today: Hoechst, Bayer, and BASF, BASF, all of which are still active in some form today. And that just comes right back to the beginning. Werner von Braun, matter cannot be destroyed, only transformed. It's these cartels that are beyond their brennschluss point. You can rejig them, you can gerrymander them, you can move these little chess pieces around on the board, as is evoked literally in the latter part of the book, but they're there to stay. That is the Raketen-Stadt, this bigger system that is essentially there looming over Slothrop in the entirety of this book. And not just Slothrop, but every character is implicated in it in some way. and it's always at the expense of someone else. That is the elect functioning with the subservience of the preterite. The V2, built by Jewish slaves in work internment camps, in the prison camps. Like, it's these are abstract concepts, and they're evoked with deeply poetic language. I do call this book a 775-page prose poem, but it is steeped in reality. These are real things that happen to real people. And I have wandered off in some random direction again.
We were talking about
Sure.
the idea of paranoia, which, and maybe it was the paranoia that also kept Slothrop going, because there's that quote about religiousness of paranoia or anti-paranoia, and that the idea that if you were for the anti-paranoid, it's the idea that nothing is happening for a reason, that there is no connection to anything. And so maybe Slothrop went full 180 and just said, you know what, I'm not, and then just kind of disappeared. But we were talking about, sorry, that was just another random thought. There's so many random thoughts from one thing to the other, about the antagonist of they, them,
Yep.
and paranoia.
Well, there's a lot of different hats you could hang that on. Who is the antagonist? I think one that's commonly reached for by readers who have kind of started the book as well is Bleachero, Dominus Bleachero, or Colonel. Is he? I always screw this up. In V, he's either a colonel or a major, and in GR, he is demoted from V. So I'm trying to remember which one he is. Anyway, doesn't matter. People they reach for him oftentimes as an antagonist in the book. If we were to lend credence to that theory, I mean, he is what I view as a direct analog from Walter Dornberger, who was Werner von Braun's direct overseer at the Peenemünde rocketry facility in northern Germany, which is featured repeatedly in this book. But he's, I don't know, I kind of view him as like Albrecht the dwarf in Wagner's Ring, which I don't think that's an unfair comparison, because Bleachero canonically loves Wagner. He repeatedly evokes him. But if you think about who that dwarf is in The Ring, he's the focal antagonist at the start in Das Rheingold, the original of the four parts of the Ring cycle. He's the focal antagonist, but he's not the overarching villain. A lust for power, which is shared by all the key players in the Ring cycle, giants, dwarves, gods, etc. That's the problem. This desire to accumulate more and more and control more and more. And that kind of loops back into what you're trying to do this season with this concept of control. I think it's bigger than Bleachero. He's an interesting character. I think he's a conflicting character, insofar as I think he legitimately loves Gottfried, in spite of all the abuse he wreaks upon him. But he has no choice at the end but to load him into that rocket and send him to Kingdom fucking Come. Do you have any particular thoughts on him as sort of an antagonistic character?
I think he's, if you were to call it disease and symptom, he's a symptom, and a very aggressive one at that. But the idea that he loves Gottfried is, I think, a complicated one, considering the power dynamics. I don't know if love, I mean, there's probably some love in there, but it's hard to call it fully.
It's deeply problematic. Yes. I'm not saying it's normal love. Like, he's a despicable character, but I think he is striving for some kind of nobility, I think, in this final sort of sadistic, masochistic quest by loading Gottfried into the rocket. This is back to the idea of esoteric Nazism. It's something that I read about like 3 months ago, and it tickled my brain in an interesting way. And I'm just going to see if I can dig it up here. Give me a second.
While you're digging, just the idea of finding Like I think the companion to Gravity's Rainbow is just a minefield of different places you can send your time and mind. But just as an overall note, it's so hard not to get wrapped up in finding history, context, interpretations, analysis of this book, and just there's just so many places to go that it's it's almost burdensome at times. At least for me, sometimes you have to abandon it and just, and we can talk about it, and we kind of talked about how it is when you approach this book. If the amount of knowledge that you certainly possess and have made reference to, is that a prerequisite to enjoying the novel and reading the novel?
Yeah. You bring up Weisenberger's Companion. I want to kind of put out as a caveat. I think it's fucking phenomenal that Steve Weisenberger took the time to create that thing. I think it's wonderful that that it exists, and I think it's a great companion to the book. My problem with it, with particularly new readers of the book, is that it leads people down rabbit holes from which there is a lot. I think I've called them roach motels before. They're very easy to get into, very difficult to get out of, to get back to the larger picture. This is why these conversations become shotgun blasts of topics, because there's so many different ways you can take it. But to your point, to your question, do you need to know all the bits and pieces to get something out of this? No, I don't think so, because it's really funny and it's beautifully written. You actually don't have to latch on to any of the narrative or diegetic material to enjoy it. I think diving into the individual historical elements make it a richer reading, but I think you can save that for subsequent readings, because there's kind of, I think there's about three people or three types of relationships that people have to this book. There's the people who try it and it's not for them and they nope out. Completely fine. There's the people who try it, aren't into it, but power through to the end to say they can read it. Say they've read it through to completion. Also fine. I don't know a lot of people who have read it to the end, thoroughly enjoyed it all the way through, and haven't had the impulse to go back and try and unearth more. And that's why I say you can always come back to it. I think it's a book where the contours of Pynchon's worldview are raised in more starker relief the more times you go through with it and the greater familiarity you get with it. So I don't think you need to know this stuff to enjoy it. I just think it'll make a more meaningful experience as you come back to it down the track.
The novel has a way of, and I think you made reference to it in the episode we've already recorded, has a way of sort of haunting the present, especially if you pay attention to anything in the news. There's a way that it just keeps recurring as a reference point for the way it captured a large part of the world.
Well, you use the phrase that Pynchon he keeps a degree of distance between himself and a clear, firm interpretation of what these antagonistic elements are, and I think that's by design, because so much of the conceptual material in this book can be applied to what's going on in the world today. He couches it in Der Raketen-Stadt, or the elect versus the preterite. I mean, if you want to look at the elect versus preterite, that you could distill it into a term, and the term I would use is colonialism, which is absolutely still going on today. I don't think we need to bring up a discussion of what's going on in the Middle East to understand that it's been going on since the 60s. I mean, just colonialism in general. Remember, Pynchon wrote that letter to one of his fans, a fan of V, and he said, what's going on in the Vietnam War is illustrative of what happened to the Hereros in Sudwest Africa. colonialism is steeped all throughout this book. Just you could abstract it out, a force of division and disassociation and disillusion, but you could also bring it right back in, spiraling out from and nodding back into. So let's knot back into. You've got the new Turkish alphabet, which is imposed by the Russians on the Kyrgyz people. You've got the dodo bird extinction by Katya's grandfather or great-grandfather. Yeah. Obviously, the Herero genocide in Sudwest Africa and the forcible extraction of the zone Hereros. Even as simple as the fact that the V2 rockets, as they land on London, land almost exclusively, or at least more densely, on the east end, the poorer part of London. This is, again, a system that can only operate, it can only allow the haves to function at the level that they do at the expense of the have-nots.
You mentioned something about IG Farben, and I don't know if it was them specifically or if this is a conversation we've had or if this was something I read in the research about during the Allied bombings in Germany and how certain factories were not bombed almost seemingly on purpose to avoid a disruption in
that was something we talked
industries.
about off mic. Yeah.
It was. Okay. I couldn't remember. But yeah,
Yep, absolutely.
Stuff.
And it's there's so many instances you can turn to of things like that happening. One, and this is a slight divergence here, but one that I always thought that was interesting if you're looking at kind of the preterite and who gets buried under the detritus of history. There's a sequence in the book that I really have never known entirely what to do with, and that's the Kyrgyz light sequence, which happens in, I believe it's the beginning of the In the Zone sequence, but it might be Casino Hermann Goring. And it's always been interesting and thought-provoking, and I understand kind of the idea of the imposition of the new Turkish alphabet as language is a very common form of oppression. But what's going on with this light? And just sort of in my tracings through my little rambles through rabbit holes, as Weisenberger and others have compelled us to do, I found out some history about the Semipalatinsk test site. Have you heard of this place? It was a nuclear test site that's located just a few hundred kilometers from the Kyrgyzstan border. And there were an unrecorded number of nuclear tests that were carried out secretly in that region. And for the Kyrgyz people who witnessed that light from the explosion, it could have potentially been conceived or interpreted as some divine religious experience. And I think that's a nice analog to the Nevada test sites in the American, in the U.S., where the U.S. government appropriated the land of I believe it's the Shushan people. I'm probably saying that wrong, but 1951, 814, I think, nuclear tests have been done on indigenous land sites. There's always someone who gets buried under the rubble of history. And it serves those who stand to benefit, and it most definitely does, and to those who don't. And I think we've gone off on a tangent again.
Yeah, but you're kind of making me coming back to what we were talking about at the beginning of whether or not there's this idea of hope in Pynchon. And this conversation is definitely leaning me away from that idea. And I'm thinking of Byron the Bulb again, who talks about being sort of cursed to know the truth, but unable to change anything
Byron.
About it. And there's a sense that Pynchon, as a writer in his works, in this one in particularly, but definitely in Crying of Blood 49 and V, I don't know much about the later, but I assume something similar. But in those first three novels and in Gravity's Rainbow, of sort of burdened with this sense of knowing these things about the world and only being able to do something about it through creation, through creating fiction, which maybe acts as a counterforce, maybe doesn't, but in the writing, and you talk about it being a prose poem. I'm curious, just to kind of change directions a little bit, why do you think this style, because at least in the novels that I've read of Pynchon, this is the most experimental or wild, I would say, in terms of places it goes, syntax and grammar, vocabulary, jargon, poetic description, rides into darkness, into lightness. It's kind of all over the place. There's use of different styles and genres. What do you make of the choices Pynchon uses in that style in this prose poem? Do you think, I mean, it seems certainly intentional. So what thoughts do you have on that?
At the sort of simplest level as a work of craftsmanship, I think that's just Pynchon using the capacities of language to their fullest extent, much in the same way that Joyce did so with Ulysses. But if there's an actual kind of intentionality behind it, one thought I've had in the past is that this fractured, disintegrating narrative structure somewhat reflects the kind of the paranoid or terrified psychology of people who have lived through war. If you think about what the Vergeltungswaffe 2, the V2, what this weapon was like to live under, you're living in the London East End, and at any point while walking to the grocery store, a mate's house, whatever it is you're doing, you could be disappeared off the planet by something that moves so quickly that it will hit you before you hear it coming. Like, what would that do to a person's thought processes and psychology in that era? Like, it must have been utterly terrifying. And then you've got kind of, you sort of mentioned earlier, another possible reading you could take of it is it mirrors the dissolution of the American counterculture, which was positioned to be this counterweight or this counterforce to this aggregation of military industrial capital, all in a couple of central nodes of power. But 1973, which was when this novel was published, so written in the decades prior, that was kind of the year that the counterculture really ended. And I mean, it was, a lot of it was just due to a decline in motivation and idealism, partly because it was perceived that some of the goals of the counterculture were achieved in terms of civil rights and liberties and gender equality. But I think another reason is that a lot of the countercultural figures of note died. Malcolm X, Dr. King, Fred Hampton, Richard Farina, to whom the novel is dedicated. It's this sort of idea that we had a chance to oppose this, and now all he's really got left to him, and I'm referring to Pynchon now, is expression. And I always come back to this line. It's at the beginning of part 4 when Roger Mexico interrupts the counterforce meeting. And he says something to the effect of, the only way to stop their systems of order are to use their systems of chaos. And I think that's Pynchon kind of disrupting both the conventional modes of how this information was conveyed to an audience in the 70s, trying to kind of expose, hey, this is actually how the functionings of this world work. But also as kind of a reflection of what it was to live through that period. Option 2 is just the guy was taking a whole shitload of LSD, and this is what seemed right to him. I think that's a lazy interpretation, but I don't deny the possibility that the guy was probably wicked high at certain points.
Yeah. I think maybe, I don't know if it's in Slow Learner or somewhere, I think he makes reference to reading parts of Gravity's Rainbow and not remembering what they're supposed to mean. Was it in the intro to Slow Learner, or is that in somewhere else?
Intro, and I can only say that because I just read Slow Learner again recently. That is a quote that is attributed to Pynchon regularly. I'm not convinced that that's not apocryphal. Because I've never seen a primary source on that. It might be true, but I think that's just remember how I talked that there's a couple of different responses that people can take? I think that's the avenue that people go down when they want to divest themselves of the work necessary to try and make sense of this novel. I think it's all a bit too clean, a bit too simple. And I also don't think he could have so many of these interwoven nodes nodding into and spiraling out from that consistently occur all throughout the book, right up until the very final pages. I don't think it is purely the product of someone who's on a drug trip. I think it's partly. Pretty sure he was smoking a lot of pot and doing some form of tryptamines at the time. It was, by all accounts, the late 60s when he started writing this, but I think there's more to it than that.
Yeah, it seems like a convenient sort of escape hatch, parachute, whatever, as a way to delude interpretation. But it does appear for some reason, I feel like in a lot of secondary sources, that quote, and I'd actually be curious to see where the actual source is, what the original source comes from.
It might be someone like Jules Siegel who wrote the "Who is Pynchon and Why Did He Run Off with My Wife" article, which you gotta be careful with any of those articles that say, "Oh, I knew Pynchon from X and X point in time." I treat all with large grains of salt. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, let me. Is there? I mean, there's so many things we can talk about, even still. But I'm curious if there's anything you feel. I guess someone who's read the book and maybe thinking about going in again. Is there anything you would recommend them doing, or any advice you would give? Anything you would think they should pay particular attention to?
I think there's something to be said for maintaining a degree of distance from the book in the early reads of it. And what I mean by that is kind of getting back to the idea of don't get bogged down in the individual details, because there are so many of them. I mean, just think about the structure of this conversation, how many different kind of little diversions we've had to go down to as people who've read it a couple of times. My thoughts are just try to hold on to big picture concepts. But in saying that, I would point to a couple of key scenes in the book that I think are worth spending some close reading time with. I would go with Slothrop going down the toilet in the Roseland Ballroom in part 1. The Walter Rathenau seance in part 1 as well. I think probably the most important chapter in the entire book would be Franz Pöckler's time as a rocket engineer in Pienemund, his sort of rocket tale, which could have been a novella in and of itself. I would focus on that. That's in part 3. And the final scene with Roger Mexico and the counterforce interrupting the meeting of the elect, and then what follows shortly thereafter, the interview by the counterforce spokesperson with the Wall Street Journal. I think if you were to hone in on a couple of key scenes, I would focus on those. I also think that there are a couple of really excellent essays. We mentioned this in our last recording, but Anachronism Intended, that essay on the sort of chronological superimposition of the 1960s over the 1940s, is a really good sort of dozen-page long study of what he's trying to do with the multiple timelines of the book. And I also think having a basic understanding of the Beaumark missile, which you can do through Joshua Coman's essay, V2 to Beaumark, those will help you kind of understand how Pynchon found his way into this story.
Apologies. Still working out some kinks with this new program, and my audio was lost near the end of the recording. But this transition here was final remarks on the novel. Here are Seth's, and I think he does a great job of summarizing some of his key ideas from the book.
Difficult to summarize here. Look, I think my capacity for optimism as a person living in the period of time that I do is limited. Not gone, but limited. And well, cry me a fucking river, I guess. But I think the price that I pay for loving this book so much is that every time I read it over, the contours of Pynchon's worldview are raised into sharper relief, and I lose another piece of that optimism as it relates to where we're headed as a race. But I consider that trade-off and the pain it causes worth it, because minds who can expose the functioning of a rotten society, or rather the rotten power structures that overlay a society, people who can write about this with such incredible beauty and intelligence really only come by once every couple of generations. And so I guess that's a way of saying I'm glad to have been born at a point along the timeline where this text hasn't entirely faded into obscurity. I think it's an important book. I think it's a great book, one of the great, one of the best even. And it, as you grow more familiarity with it, it kind of hurts more and more to read, to just realize how little has changed since 1945 when it takes place, 1960-ish, 60 at the end of the 60s where it's also placed, 73 when it was published. Just again and again, these repeating cycles occur over and over again. But I guess that's another reason that it remains so meaningful to me personally, is because it never loses its relevance. So read it. It's worth it. It's worth the effort. It's worth the time. It's worth turning your brain to mush for it.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed that episode. Next up in Season 2 of Control will be J.M. Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians. And that episode is going to be released on Wednesday, the 7th of February. So we hope you read along with us and check that episode when it comes out. You can find Seth online. He's on Twitter at Waste Mailing, Instagram at Waste Mailing List. He's got a Substack, wastemailinglist.substack.com, which is great. And he's got his own BookTube channel. Search Waste Mailing List and you'll find him talking all sorts of crazy great books. We also have an interview with Seth up on our blog, so check that out, booksofsomesubstance.com, and you can find us on all social media at booksofsubstance. Until next time, happy reading.